Public school is filled with the famed teachings of great scientists, mathematicians, and statesmen. Benjamin Franklin's kite experiment with lightning was not only a breakthrough in electricity, but an iconic moment in history that nearly overshadows his many achievements in the founding of the United States. E equals mc squared seems to need no further explanation. It's the most famous formula of the world's most famous physicist. The apple falling onto Isaac Newton's head allegedly inspired his discoveries of gravity, while Newton's 3 laws of motion in turn opened the doors to an age of science. And while Newton takes credit as co-founder of calculus, it is the Pythagorean theorem that is most famous to geometry students, who must prove the properties of triangles and other shapes. But missing from all these textbook teaching moments is anything resembling a full picture. All of these giants, and many others, held a secret doctrine little known to the public and almost never taught in schools. Number 1. Pythagoras. Of course, it is fitting for our first subject, Pythagoras, who believed that knowledge should be kept from the vulgar masses and restricted to a learned elite introduced into his secret society. Yes, Pythagoras, best known to the world for his formula a squared plus b squared equals c squared, which shows that the square of the length of the hypotenuse of a right triangle is always equal to the sum of the squares of the other 2 sides, was also the pseudo-messianic figure of ancient Greece, who developed a literal cult following under the secret society he established, which combined mathematics and philosophy. He led this order of the Pythagoreans, despite the fact that it became a capital offense to follow his teachings, until the school building itself was burned and he was either exiled or assassinated by rivals who were suspicious of his teachings, jealous of being kept in the dark, and who supported a more democratic form of rule. Alive from approximately 570 BC to 495 BC, though some say he lived to age 100, he was well educated and born to a wealthy family from the wealthiest of Greek islands, Samos, the one nearest to Turkey's shore. According to the account, while his mother was pregnant, an oracle predicted that her unborn son would surpass in beauty and wisdom all who ever lived and would be of the greatest advantage to the human race in everything pertaining to the life of man. Hence, Pythagoras was believed to be a divine descendant of the god Apollo, sent to redeem the human race, something of a near Christ-like figure born 500 years before Jesus. After coming of age, Pythagoras traveled the world and was initiated into secret orders throughout, gathering wisdom from the Brahmins in India, the Hierophants in Egypt, the Persians, the Oracle of Delphi, the Kabbalist and Chaldean Magi, among other initiated priesthoods who harbored ciphers and other, quote, secret symbolic writings. After returning to his home in Samos to find it overtaken by a dictator, an exiled and unwelcome Pythagoras set up his influential school in Crotone, founded by Achaean Greeks in southern Italy, responsible for working out the mathematics of musical harmonies, colors, astronomy, and the earth. Pythagoras was even reputed to hold power over the moods of water and wind, equally able to calm the winds of a storm or calm the moods of an angry person with his lyre. His teachings were patently secret and never allowed to be written down. Furthermore, Pythagoras addressed neophyte initiates of his secret order only from behind the curtain, very Wizard of Oz, and even the true meaning of Pythagoras' geometrical formulas remained a well-kept secret, which his students could learn only after taking a 5-year vow of silence. So chances are there's a deeper and more important meaning behind even the universally taught a squared plus b squared equals c squared formula. A progressive series of initiations was required to advance into his inner ring of disciples, who were said to be constantly contemplating the transmigration of the soul after death, as well as the nature and identity of the, quote, perfect number. The Pythagorean scholars also happened to be among the most important members of society, both in ancient Greece and abroad, and were taught certain signs and words by which they might know each other. Within a few years, some 300 initiates, all Pythagoreans, held the sovereignty of Croton, and soon dozens of other city-states diffused across ancient Greece. According to the National Gazette in the early 19th century, this sage of Samos had conceived the sublime idea of forming a school of enlightened statesmen who might govern the world, while they themselves were governed by wisdom and virtue. It appears that Pythagoras had crafted the first workable conspiracy for global domination, one which pursued governance by an aristocracy which could avoid the, quote, dangerous tendency of democratic turbulence, as well as the dangers of a jealous tyrant. But shh, don't tell the kids in school about that one. Many of his secrets have remained untold to history, while others have been passed down through the ages via secret orders, including the Masons and Rosicrucians. Much of what is known about Pythagoras was passed down by Plato, his most famous student, who lived after Pythagoras had already died. And yet, nothing more is said about the man in any kind of textbook, mathematical or otherwise, than his contribution to a simple but sound mathematical formula. But then again, the same trend continues in more recent and better documented times. Number 2, Sir Isaac Newton. The entire era of modern science emerged out of his work. He was an essential figure in the Enlightenment and all that it affected. Sir Isaac Newton's 1687 book, Principia, aka Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, which he wrote in Latin, is widely considered one of the most important works of all time, and it is said that it, quote, completed the scientific revolution. And yet, the quintessential icon of modern science was also more deeply steeped in the supposedly unscientific practices of alchemy and the occult than almost any other person in history. Yes, the man who defined gravity, established the 3 laws of motion, and also calculus, along with many other contributions to science including optics and light, was deeply and wholly steeped in the dark arts that have so often been scoffed away and ridiculed, or alternately feared and outlawed. According to the New York Times, Sir Isaac had a whole other full-time career, a parallel intellectual passion that he kept largely hidden from view, but that rivaled and sometimes surpassed in intensity his devotion to celestial mechanics. Newton was a serious alchemist who spent night upon dawn for 3 decades of his life, slaving over a Stygian furnace in search of the power to transmute one chemical element into another. Isaac Newton also left behind countless unpublished writings on his true obsessions, including alchemy, a dirty little secret that was technically illegal and potentially discrediting to his legacy. Unsurprisingly, his heirs, both relatives and ideological successors, buried these alchemical writings and sought to conceal this other, complex and easily misunderstood side of Newton for hundreds of years. Loaded with millions of words and endless pages written on controversial and even heretical theological topics, his extensive dabbling in the dark arts and the bizarre codes prompted a consultant to Newton's heirs, who happened to also belong to the Royal Society, to quickly dismiss his writings as unfit for publication, in other words, best covered up and kept from the masses. The vast majority of these papers didn't come to light publicly until socialist economist John Maynard Keynes bought them for his personal collection at auction in 1936, and finally confronted the world with Newton's ties to alchemy. Most of the documents, however, were handwritten copies that Newton made of other people's work. Whether or not he cracked the code in alchemy and transformed man's understanding, as he had in physics and mathematics, remains a mystery. However, certain papers that he left behind shed a curious light on his quest for the Philosopher's Stone. The Chemical Heritage Foundation recently purchased a manuscript written in Newton's hand that it published in full online. As phys.org reports, quote, "What is intriguing about the manuscript is that the main page is a recipe, hand-copied by Newton, that describes a method of creating sulfic mercury, a supposedly necessary ingredient for making the Philosopher's Stone. Newton then added notes to the text and later apparently turned the document over and used the blank side to write a procedure for subliming lead ore, an endeavor that he apparently worked on for many years, once again as part of his desire to make the Philosopher's Stone. This Philosopher's Stone, the one sought after by mystics and supposedly obtained by the Rosicrucians, could turn base metals into gold and even unlock the secrets of time and immortality. Newton was often publicly accused of belonging to the Rosicrucian order as well as to the Freemasons, as were many others of the elite Royal Society, while Newton was arguably, but unprovably, one such learned initiate. Newton himself was a longtime member of the Royal Society, and later, after achieving fame, became its president for 24 years until his death, apparently obsessed with decoding history's hidden ciphers, sacred texts, and messages. Newton's writings also reveal that he obsessively charted the chronology of the Bible, attempting to decode prophecies and other hidden secrets embedded in the text. Among other interests, he attempted to calculate the date of the apocalypse, which he projected as being not before 2060 and likely not after 2300. We'll see, huh? In particular, Newton apparently believed that Solomon's temple and other biblical structures contained hidden mathematical codes and cryptic knowledge that he attempted to unveil, just as the Freemasons, Rosicrucians, and other esoteric cults have. Of interest were the sacred geometrical features of Solomon's temple, which he studied and wrote about over a 50-year period of his life. For Newton, the Bible was encoded with mathematical problems related to the formula for pi, the Earth's dimensions, and a cryptic mathematical blueprint for just about everything, which corresponded with a detailed chronology of Hebrew history and promised to reveal the elusive measurement of the, quote, sacred Hebrew cubit. As scholar Tessa Morrison explained, Isaac Newton determined that Solomon's temple was constructed in, quote, divine proportions, square, symmetrical, and laid out to a celestial plan. Newton felt that just as the writings of ancient philosophers, scholars, and biblical figures held unknown sacred wisdom, the same was true of their architecture, which he believed these men used to hide their knowledge, in a complex code of symbolic and mathematical language. While we're supposed to believe that Newton's laws are immutable, unquestionable, and govern everything on Earth, we're also supposed to completely ignore the fact that after over 40 years of intense study, Newton had come to believe that ancient human history had been recorded entirely wrong. For at least 4 decades of his life, Newton meticulously read and studied ancient historical texts, including all primary and major literary works, beginning with ancient and Oriental mythology, after which he came to the conclusion that many events recorded as ancient history actually happened much more recently, sometimes hundreds and even thousands of years closer to present day than what has been generally accepted as the timeline of human history. This includes everything from the Trojan War occurring at least 300 years more recently to key ancient Egyptian dates happening some 1800 years after the dates that have been traditionally taught in schools. Newton's written works on this include The Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms, Amended, which was first published in French a few years before his death and was, to his annoyance, published against his wishes. Its contents were controversial to say the least, with critics even claiming that Newton must have gone senile in his old age, despite the fact that he had been obsessively studying ancient chronology and revising his manuscripts for at least half of his life. The question is, if Newton devoted so much of his life to writing and studying these mysteries, and if they were never meant for respectable and public publication, then for whom were they written? Because it is clear that this was no mere dabbling to pass the time. Newton's Bible code search was part of a life that afforded no time to trivial pursuits such as leisure, romance, or sports. Who indeed was Newton's intended audience? Was there a secret patron for this darker side of his scientific and mathematic arts? Meanwhile, Newton's long presidency of the Royal Society also overlapped his 3 decades at the helm of the Royal Mint, which was more interesting than it sounds. especially since his appointment to the position was intended to be largely a cushy job in name only, but was instead taken deadly serious by Newton. In many ways an extension of alchemy, Newton oversaw England's Great Recoinage of 1696, a comprehensive move to turn in and replace the worn-down silver and gold coins that were in circulation, many of which were commonly clipped around the edges, an illegal practice that reduced the weight and therefore the value, which was of particular importance since the bullion weight of the coins was already worth more in foreign markets than the face value of the coin anyway. The recoinage was a priority as the Bank of England, privately owned like the Federal Reserve, had been established just 2 years prior in response to the debts accumulated after England's failed war with France. Newton, the hard-nosed warden of the mint, examined the coins turned in and found that about 20% of the nation's money was counterfeit, setting Newton off on an undercover investigation wherein he became deputized in various local counties as a justice of the peace, while posing as a local in order to interrogate hundreds of witnesses at taverns, bars, and other public centers about illegal coining practices in order to gather enough evidence for what was otherwise a rather difficult prosecution to pursue. In the end, Newton saw some 28 counterfeiters convicted. As this crime was considered high treason, it was punishable by death, in a barbaric and elaborate ritual of public execution that involved hanging, drawing, and quartering the victim, wherein the punished individual was drawn by horse on a wooden panel, hung almost to the point of death, and afterwards the body was emasculated, disemboweled, beheaded, and then quartered, that is, cut into 4 pieces. Quite a price to pay for a common financial crime, and quite great lengths that Newton took in order to see things through. Mark Ratner, a materials chemist at Northwest University, told the New York Times, quote, "He was brutal. He sentenced people to death for trying to scrape the gold off of coins. Make no mistake about it," said Dr. Ratner, "he was not a nice guy." What his papers also reveal is the formal scientific knowledge he presented to the public in his books did not include discussion of the process by which Newton derived his knowledge. Apparently, he just didn't want people to know anything about the math work or the philosophy behind it, other than the conclusions, in many cases taken literally as scientific law. As Wired magazine reported, quote, "He didn't leave any working pages of the first edition of the Principia, just a clean copy that he sent to the printer when he was finished. The Principia went through 3 editions, and there were many drafts between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3. They showed a lot, but he actually covered up his methods in the published works. He presented the discoveries of optics in a formal language that covered up the traces of the hard work that one assumes went into it. And it's because Newton didn't want people to know how he had come to his knowledge. I think that might relate to his religious beliefs regarding anti-Trinitarianism. He believed that there was an elite cadre of people that were given the truth of religion, and the vulgar masses weren't strong enough." End quote. So ultimately, Newton, a trusted knight of the crown and a scion of establishment science, held the same view as Pythagoras, that the truth should be confined to a chosen few who've proven themselves worthy, and everyone else be damned. Number 3, Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, the guy with the kite, but also the inventor of bifocals, the lightning rod, and some weird glass harmonica that nobody uses anymore because it reportedly drove people crazy. He was once president of Pennsylvania, but never of the United States. However, he was the only American to have signed all 4 documents fundamental to the creation of the U.S., the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the Treaty of Alliance with France in 1778, the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War in 1783, and the U.S. Constitution, which he signed in 1787, just a couple of years before his death. And with only a couple years of formal education and an apprenticeship under his brother as a printer, he became an avid author, witticist, publisher, scientist, and even the Postmaster General, first for Pennsylvania, then for the British Crown and the American colonies, and later for the United States. He became the Grand Master Mason of Pennsylvania before he was even 30 years old, and remained active in various secret societies throughout his life, including the notorious and debaucherous Hellfire Club that he frequently visited in England, while his hidden motives in promoting revolution in America still remain under question. Chief among them was Benjamin Franklin, a double agent working for Britain. Former CIA Director Allen Dulles himself admitted that Franklin was a spy master, for the Americans anyway, and while negotiating for a key alliance with France, he was supposedly maneuvering his spies in Britain and was continuously knowledgeable of fresh reports from military generals concerning the situation in the American colonists as it was told to the king, even as he himself was surrounded by spies and informants in Paris. Dulles writes, quote, "How many spies surrounded Franklin, and how many he himself had in England, we shall probably never know." One such spy was Edward Bancroft, another American who was Franklin's chief assistant in Paris, and who was outed by the British a century or so after the Revolution as one of their top assets, and a close confidant of Franklin's. Historian Cecil B. Curry and author Richard Deacon uncovered a different story after examining 18th century papers from the British Secret Service and finding evidence that the beloved, quote, "first American" was in actuality a British agent referred to in dispatches as number 72. Cue the James Bond music. Doo-doo, doo-doo. And that Franklin, as a British mole and double agent, was actually working hand-in-hand with Edward Bancroft and other notorious spies on the British payroll, who were just as interested in penetrating the inner circle of French power as they were at understanding and undermining the American moves. Curiously, Franklin later shielded Bancroft from accusations of betraying the Americans and even denounced his accusers. Moreover, Richard Deacon alleges that the Hellfire Club, to which Franklin belonged and frequently attended during his extensive time in Europe, was more than just a secret society orgy site for wealthy rakes that met underground in a cave beneath a church, where they conducted mock satanic rituals and wore monk robes and masks while cavorting with prostitutes who called themselves nuns. The Hellfire Club was also cover for meetings between British spies and a secret weapon of British intelligence, which may partially explain the presence of the famed American scientist and diplomat, who was reportedly known there as Brother Benjamin of Cookham. The leader of the Hellfire Club, Sir Francis Dashwood, at one time Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer, as well as its Postmaster General, was also implicated as a spy and was a close confidant of Brother Benjamin, who not only stayed with Dashwood at his residence, but co-authored a heretical book on the Church of England with him. Dashwood reportedly boasted in his later years that, quote, "Brother Benjamin of Cookham remained our friend and secret ally all the time he was in the enemy camp," unquote. Another one of Franklin's close associates and fellow Hellfire Club members was the notorious French diplomat and spy Chevalier d'Eon de Beaumont, an androgynous man who frequently dressed, apparently convincingly, as a woman and even infiltrated the Russian court, successfully becoming lady-in-waiting to Empress Elizabeth. During this life of fame, achievement, and duplicity, Benjamin Franklin apparently passed along detailed information about American shipping activities and kept the British in the loop on palace intrigues in Paris, as well as nearly every move of the American diplomats in France. If the theory holds true, and Franklin was number 72, he appears to have served two masters, and reportedly held the idea that a free America was ultimately somehow compatible with an all-powerful British Empire, while he meanwhile apparently also hedged his bets on a land speculation claim under the British Grand Ohio Company for territory in Virginia that he would gain if and only if Britain, rather than America, had won the war. And as if that weren't enough skeletons in the closet, there's also the matter of the 10 bodies found buried beneath Benjamin Franklin's number 36 Craven Street residence in London. which included the bodies of 6 children who were apparently buried there during the American Patriots' time of residence while representing Philadelphia before the court of King George III. Modern history, however, has vouched for the Founding Father by attributing the macabre scene to his roommate, Dr. William Hewson, an anatomy student and, like Franklin, a member of the Royal Society, who apparently set up a lab in the basement while examining cadavers surreptitiously obtained from local cemeteries, which were already dead when they arrived at his former residence. But there are many reasons to question whether these corpses were part of something more sinister, including why so many of them were of children, for indeed Franklin and his dubious cohorts have kept many secrets from us all, and were known to engage in, some rather questionable rituals. After all, who would bury nearly a dozen bodies, the majority of whom were children, in the basement, all while the rest of the tenants in the house, including Hewson's own wife, children, and mother-in-law, not to mention Franklin, had to smell them? Whatever the case, it was enough for the modern-day relevant authorities to open an inquiry, dig up the remains, and raise eerie alarm bells in the media. In total, what is it that's behind the mysteries, intrigue, and contradictions of one of America's most famous and well-respected patriots? How did he rise to such prominence, and to whom did his true allegiance lie? It's worth noting that Franklin's own illegitimate son, William, publicly at odds with his father, remained a British loyalist throughout the American Revolution, even after he was arrested as a British spy. On Franklin the father, Richard Deacon and Tom McMorrow write, quote, "Let it be considered that he was a poor tradesman's son, attending school only 2 years, and was working in a shop at 12. But later in life, when in the company of such men as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams, all cultured aristocrats and future presidents, he was the most accomplished among them. With virtually no schooling, he had taught himself several foreign languages, science and mathematics, and was publishing Poor Richard's Almanac by the time he was 26. He authored the definitive work of the time on electricity, swayed the British Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act, and was honored by the universities of Yale, Harvard, Oxford, and Edinburgh, the Royal Society of Britain, and the Royal Academy of Science in France." End quote. The fact is little known, but appears in distant newsprint accounts that the underwriting force of the earliest phase of Mr. Franklin's career in publishing was none other than the elusive Hellfire Club. Benjamin Franklin's older brother, James Franklin, was founder of the New England Courant, established in 1721, and the printing press publisher of the country's second oldest newspaper, the Boston Gazette, dating back to 1720, which put him in a significant position to influence the affairs in colonial Boston and to stir the pot of controversy, which he and his brother Benjamin were certainly lightning rods for. The latter would often masquerade under pen names such as Silas Do-Gooder. When James Franklin landed in jail and was threatened with suppression of his paper for insulting Harvard College and the clergy officials, he avoided being shut down by handing off the publishing duties to Benjamin Franklin, thus making him a successful businessman before the age of 18, but not without some backing. Both Franklins were relentless in attacking establishment figures of all kinds and provocative in every move, sowing the seeds of rebellion early on, not to mention creating a great deal of mischief, all while few suspected that a secret fraternal order were supporting them from the shadows the entire time, with an agenda that would prove to play a role in altering the course of society in the colonies. While there's plenty of room in history for the rare genius, one should not dismiss the works of a larger agenda either. It appears that the ciphers, secret dispatches, and even hidden ink messages were a staple of Franklin's life, and not merely the part of the plot of a Nicolas Cage American Treasure movie. How does that account resonate with the patriotic fervor of the 4th of July or the quaint accounts of Franklin as a lovable, witty, and jolly elder statesman that all Americans feel in the course of their bloodstream? Of course, such a man as this is too much a giant of history to question. and too nuanced to pick apart. Number 4. Albert Einstein. Even Albert Einstein, the 20th century's most famous and celebrated scientist, had his ties to the occult. In particular, it is clear that Einstein was intimately familiar with one of the best-known esoteric personalities, a self-professed spirit medium and the co-founder of the Theosophical Society, Madame Helena Blavatsky. In fact, according to multiple sources, including his own niece, Einstein always kept a heavily annotated copy of Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, on the desk in his study and promoted it to his colleagues. Journalist Jack Brown paid Einstein a visit at his home and saw the book on his desk and asked Einstein about it, prompting Einstein to read a few passages aloud, after referring to it as the Bible of the Theosophist. Some believe that Einstein's intense study of Blavatsky's work is the true source of his inspiration for E = mc squared. Whatever it was, it certainly wasn't decades of experience or an encyclopedic understanding of scientific literature. Einstein was only 26 years old in 1905 when he wrote his Annus Mirabilis papers, a miracle year during which he not only derived the infamous E = mc squared theorem, but during which he also published 5 key articles that would contribute substantially to what is today modern physics and completely change scientific history. During what was considered his most productive year ever, he came up with the theory of special relativity, mass-energy equivalence, from which E = mc squared is derived. He analyzed Brownian motion of microscopic particles in liquid and figured out the photoelectric effect, which was the paper that eventually won him the Nobel Prize in 1921. By all appearances, 1905 was a miracle year indeed, as Einstein apparently lacked access to sufficient scientific reference materials and had only his training at the Zurich Polytechnic School to draw from, as well as his own books and an informal study group to fall back on. He had, however, worked in the Bern, Switzerland Patent Office as a bureaucrat since 1902, his first real job. Perhaps a rather inspiring place to gather ideas, indeed. Wink, wink. How so many breakthroughs fell into Einstein's lap all at once remains a source of mystery and heated debate to this day. On the 20th anniversary of Einstein's death in 1975, Time magazine quoted physicist Richard Feynman as saying, quote, "I cannot understand how Einstein arrived at the intuition leading to E = mc squared, considering the level of scientific knowledge at the time in 1905. At any rate, even the most rigorous scientific minds cannot ignore the profound influence that rather unscientific pursuits have had on the most celebrated and important developments over the past 4 centuries, and even before. And perhaps there is much more to the story than we know."